Welcome to the Redefining Risk in the Ownership Economy conversation. This is the second part of a two-part conversation where we're going to really be focusing on building ownership that lasts. So my name is Victoria Montero. I'm Chief of Staff at Common Future, and I'm really excited to be moderating today's conversation. For some background on Common Future, we are a nonprofit intermediary that invests in and uplifts strategies that are focused on reshaping narratives, building power, and shifting capital flows towards community visions of an equitable economy and multiracial democracy. Throughout our 20-plus year history, much of our work has been focused on building infrastructure for community ownership, between providing catalytic, non-extractive capital to neighborhood land trusts and community fund managers, to some of our more recent work this year, running an action lab focused on Black businesses with community governance models. Across this work, we've been working with actors across the ecosystem to think about and practice the ways that we really need to rethink systems in order to center communities. And so that's really the backdrop of this conversation that we want to have today. As I said, this is the second of a two-part conversation that was inspired by the idea of the ownership economy, which has really been gaining a lot of momentum in the mainstream in recent years. While the premise is often compelling, it's based on this idea that when more people own assets, whether businesses, homes, land, or enterprises, they will have greater power and our economy becomes more inclusive and equitable. In our last conversation, we talked about the ways that this doesn't really represent the full story. While ownership is often treated as a solution to wealth inequality, it often fails to grapple with the reality that ownership gains in Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color have historically been stripped away through violence, redlining, discriminatory policy, and weakened protections that continue today. In that conversation, we also talked about the importance of community power, new narratives of ownership, and collective resilience. And so that's where we're really picking up today, to really focus on communities that are building models that not only distribute assets, but also build power. And so in today's conversation, we're going to talk about that in three parts. One, we'll hear from our panelists about their work and really dive into what community ownership means in practice. And then we'll shift to thinking about the infrastructure that's needed to support this over the long term. And lastly, we're going to finish by thinking about some of the mental models and assumptions that need to change in order for us to get there. And so with that, I am very grateful to be joined today by three incredible leaders in this space and members of our Common Future network. So first is Ismail Samad, who's the co-founder of Loiter, which activates vacant and underutilized urban spaces into community-driven hubs that center culture, participatory programming, and economic justice. Their work fosters collective ownership of public space and enables local residents to co-create programming that strengthens neighborhood wealth and belonging. Next is Adriana Bizadeh Barbour, who is the executive director of Kensington Corridor Trust, or KCT, which is in the Kensington neighborhood of Philadelphia. And KCT is a neighborhood trust that protects affordable housing and small business spaces in Philadelphia. Adriana leads initiatives that transfer property to resident-led ownership and challenges extractive real estate practices while building community governance capacity. And last but not least is Kurt Lyon, who is the executive director at Transform Finance. Transform Finance conducts research and develops frameworks to reshape capital and investment systems, support community-controlled long-term wealth building. Kurt studies governance and multi-entity structures that protect collective assets while providing tools for communities to withstand market pressures and extraction. And so with that, I'm excited to turn over to the panelists. And thank you so much for joining us. And so just to get started, I'd love to hear you all share more about your work, particularly what community ownership and building power means to you and how that shows up in your respective places. So Adriana, I'd love to hear from you first. If you can just tell us more about your work and community ownership, particularly in Kensington.
Thanks, Victoria. So again, for everyone, my name is Adriana Bisade Barbour. Excited to be with all of you. At the Kensington Quarter Trust, what we've built is a new model of collective ownership called the Neighborhood Trust Model, and we've been around for 6 years. What we do is we utilize real estate as a tool to collectivize ownership, to build neighborhood wealth, and to move policy and change systems that impact the neighborhood where that real estate is placed. And so over the last 6 years, we've acquired 31 assets into the trust. We do land conservation and building preservation. We are focused on permanently affordable housing and commercial spaces. And in that work, we are also working to attract small businesses back to a corridor that has been long time disinvested in. Post-deindustrialization, war on drugs, keep going with all of the various systems and mechanics that have gotten us to the place that we are today. But a lot of our work on the small business front is attracting small businesses to come back onto the corridor to help reduce the vacancy, to over time also help to impact some of the other really critical aspects around health and safety for the neighborhood, thinking about an activation of vacant lots in the neighborhood. And then the last thing I'll just note before we dig deeper into the conversation is our work is deeply rooted in community control and community ownership at its core. That shows up in our governance, and I'm excited to chat about that a little bit more later.
Thank you so much. Ismail, would love to hear from you too. What does that look like for Loiter?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, thanks for having me. Always pleased to be in community like this. So like Loiter is like we lean into just our unflinching narratives around like what our communities are requiring on our terms. So Loiter itself is a provocation. We have a couple of different developments that we're doing. We have Blurred Line Farm, and we have Maroon Square, and we also are working with the Cross Atlantic Chocolate Collective to help us think about how we can have a global South perspective into the development work we do as we start to do Pan-African development work. And so the key that we kind of have identified as a community is what assets do we currently have? What businesses currently exist? What homes are currently within our possession? And what property can we shift into the supply chain of some of our businesses? As a chef, I kind of focus on the food side of things. We have a sports aspect of our piece. We have farmers engaged with our work. We also have other people who are doing some pieces around art and culture and things like that. So we are trying to define it as we go. Our whole imperative, we do not want status quo thinking and doing to define the development of our communities. And just excited to just learn more as we're engaging in this work and also share some of our early learnings as we're kind of coming out here with our, I guess, our appropriate symbolism based upon the geography that we occupy.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really excited to dive into more on both fronts. Before we turn to that, Kurt, I would love to hear from you too. What brought you to this work, and particularly, how does Transform Finance think about and support long-term community wealth building?
Yeah, thanks, Victoria, and so glad to be here with all of y'all. This is going to be a really fun conversation. So, just a quick one line on Transform Finance for those who aren't familiar. We're a nonprofit that does research and advocacy, and I say organizing in the investment space to try to help investors figure out how to support models like community owned real estate and land that really are shifting the way that power, risk, and decision making is seen in the investment world. I came to this work by getting really interested and inspired by the cooperative movement as kind of like a microcosm of what a system can look like as a whole that is democratic, participatory, and there aren't extractive means within the way that economic services are provided. And my introduction to the finance angle of this was my introduction to the Boston Ujima project in Boston about 10 years ago. And I did some volunteer work for them, and really was inspired by how capital as not just a tool but a process that doesn't have to be just like a necessary input to creating community ownership, but can actually be part of the process and is so important. And that led me to Transform Finance to really dig into these questions, where I've been since 2017. So for us, how we think about long-term community wealth building, our role is really to help capital operate in a way so that the communities themselves, regardless of what kind of project it is, can successfully, have control and define their own success, and take the projects, through all of the phases, because capital is such an important factor. It can really throw a mission driven project off its original track if it's not structured properly, or it can be a really helpful support. So what we do is we do a lot of conversations, convening, interviews, to really figure out like what are the processes and practices that are happening for investment into community-owned land and real estate, and translate some of the best practices for investors, while lifting up the different models that we're seeing on the ground. And I guess lastly, in terms of the definition of community wealth building, what is our overall lens? We do look at both projects that have long-term permanent affordability, those that are focused on preventing displacement, and also those that are focused on just the wealth aspect, so sharing economic gains. And ultimately, it kind of depends on what the goals of the communities are, in terms of what kind of structure they end up putting together. And from a capital perspective, it's all about just ensuring that the community stakeholders have the ability to control the project and design how those outcomes are shaped.
Thank you so much, Kurt. And I want to pick up on the piece that you mentioned at the end, which was really just understanding what the goals of different communities look different. And that also might just influence what community ownership really means in practice. And so I'd love to just transition to hear more both from you, Adriana, and Ishmael about how this actually starts to show up, both in Kensington and East Cleveland. Maybe Adriana, would love to hear more from you about KCT, and more of what like community governance, community ownership means in the day to day. For example, can you tell us more about about how decisions are made? Like really just getting beyond like the technical ideas of governance to like how it actually shows up.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Victoria. And to Kurt's earlier point, I think so much of true and like well-practiced governance is listening to the folks who will ultimately be impacted by the work that you're deciding upon. And who better to make those decisions than the people who will be ultimately impacted by the decisions that you're making, right? And so at the trust, several years ago, after inception, after our founding board, we transitioned to neighborhood-led governance, which for us means that in order to govern at the Kensington Corridor Trust, you must live in or have a small business in our zip code, which is the 19134 zip code of Philadelphia. And so that prevents all outsiders from being at the governing table, which is a critical aspect to real power and to real control over the decisions. That does not mean that, we can't invite outsiders for some advice or hire some consultancy or, dig in around education and expertise that folks may have outside of our governance. But at the end of the day, the decisions are made by, again, the people who are going to be impacted by those decisions. The other thing that the governance very intentionally created by neighbors several years ago is they said, there are about 32,000 folks that live in these 6 census tracts that we touch that are collectively sharing ownership of this land and of the buildings. It's very inequitable and unfair to say that about 20 people will make decisions on behalf of everyone. And so for most decision making at the trust, we're actually required to do external engagement for several months prior to bringing the decision back to the codifying decision, right? So the IRS wants to see minutes with like a legal decision that's been made. You want some motions, you want to follow all the Roberts rules. We can do all of that. Happy to document those things. But our governance can't make those decisions and doesn't make those decisions because that's the way that they designed it until we've done that larger work. And so just to kind of give an example of how that shows up in practice, small business attraction, right? So I alluded to small business attraction a little bit earlier. We are acquiring real estate on Kensington Avenue. We're placing it into the trust for the neighborhood to directly own, govern, and control that real estate, which includes the commercial tenant mix. And so neighbors are getting to determine who is actually coming into these spaces that they collectively own and control, and that we're preserving affordability on. So when someone wants to lease inside of a KCT space, there's an application. The application has traditional, application questions for leasing a commercial space, including financial feasibility questions. Our staff is tasked by our governance with doing a diligence process to make sure that the business model can, in fact, generate sufficient returns, sufficient revenue to pay rent and to feed themselves. So one of the things we're very intentional about is we want to make sure that folks aren't starting businesses and then are like enduring any type of harm or hardship themselves. Not to say that, opening a business won't be difficult and that there won't be downturns, but we really want to make sure that it's something that's viable for them and their family to access upward mobility. And so we're looking at that with intention. We're bringing technical assistance around from our partner organizations as needed. Once the application is determined, like, yes, this business could be viable, we then go with the business owner into the neighborhood for about 3 to 4 months. It depends just kind of when meetings are scheduled. And we touch all 6 census tracts inside of the trust corridor boundaries. And we go to as many public meetings as possible. One of the things that we don't do at the trust is very rare that we do it, I should say, is we don't believe in creating new spaces. And so rather than saying like, hey, we're going to host a meeting so you can meet this business owner, we just ask everyone that's hosting meetings in the neighborhood over that span of time to just let us in. Give us 15 minutes. We're going to bring this potential business owner with us. We want you to get to know them, hear about their business directly, their business model directly from them. And then tell us, is this something that you actually want to have on your corridor in one of your collectively owned spaces? And it means countless meetings. It means the business owner having to repeat their business model tons and tons of times. We're totally cool with that. We typically produce a one-pager. We'll do lots of canvassing. We'll do flyering. We'll do social media. We'll text stuff out to folks. We want to make sure that as many people as possible in that span of diligence are able to weigh in and let us know whether or not they want this business on their corridor. Once we have like a resounding yes, then we can go back to the governing table and say, hey, they've passed the financial diligence. Here's the information for that. The neighborhood has said they do want this business in place, and then we can legally engage into a lease once the governing board makes the final decision. But again, I couldn't just go as a staff person. I couldn't go just straight to the governance and say, hey, there's this business that applied. We think they'd be great. It just doesn't work that way. And it was designed by them. And I think that's the beauty of governance is that when you are in control and you, what we call our governing table, we call them the power table, right? So when you are in control of that power table, you have the ability to decide what the process is, right? Forget that you get to make the final decision. You get to also determine like, how do we make this decision? And when do we make certain types of decisions? And how many people are required to make that decision? Is it consensus -1? Is it simple majority? All of that was built by neighbors. And it makes for one, just a really beautiful and collaborative process, but two, it ensures that people have the opportunity to truly come forward and engage in governance around the collectively shared assets in a way that is meaningful and impactful. And here's what happens, right? So here's the kind of the there of what happens next. So say, for example, so currently right now we are about to open, hopefully in Q1, pending construction, a grocery store on Kensington Avenue. This was one of the very first things that the trust was asked to accomplish when we were formed 6 years ago. And for folks who are in the grocery store space, particularly in neighborhoods experiencing food apartheid, you know how difficult it is to launch a grocery store. So we've been working at it all this time. We finally have one coming Q1. When we identified that operator, we underwent the same exact process. So even though the neighborhood asked us to get the grocery store, that grocery store business owner still had to come with us, do the engagement on the neighborhood, present themselves, introduce themselves, talk about what they plan to do in the collectively owned space. What that's built in now is an automatic base of customers because now all of the neighbors know that this grocery store is coming to their collectively owned space. It's what they asked for. They like the business owner. They're excited about the business model. And so what we've seen at the Trust is we've been leasing now commercial spaces for 3 years. We've not lost a single business that we've attracted to the corridor. Our very first business is in the process of preparing to open a second location that is not on Kensington Avenue. So they're adding to their wealth building strategy for them and their family. They've created living wage jobs, and they're just like a critical asset inside of the neighborhood. So people look to them and look for them and are seeking them out. And it's all because we've done the work of building relationships. We've done the work of making sure that the trust continues to be stewarded. And people are excited to support the businesses that are in the collectively owned spaces. And so it just becomes like this full circle both from like a circular economy standpoint, but also like just full circle around process and the way that we build with intentionality. So that's just one example of the way that governance shows up, right? That's like one of very many examples that I could offer around decision making. But that's how we do small business attraction, and that process was built again, as I said, by the neighbors who collectively own the land.
Thank you so much. I think that's so powerful from so many different perspectives. I think some of the things that I'm hearing is one, even these governance decision-making structures don't necessarily have to be predetermined when you decide to set the trust. It's like that's really the moment where you can really hear from community on how they want to make decisions. And it can really just look different, which I think is really powerful. And you see that all the way through to the ways that they're actually shaping their neighborhood. I also just love this piece about not setting up this meeting that you're expecting everybody to come to, but it's like actually we're going to meet people where they're at, like at these established meetings. And so I think that that also really helps to just make sure that folks are really like informed and like engaging in the process. And so that can really translate all the way down to this piece around actually ensuring success with the circular economy. It's like everybody is bought into this because they're able to like meet the store owners and they're really from the community. So I think that's powerful from so many different angles. Before we move on to our next question, I just want to acknowledge we see the questions in the chat. Thank you so much, and please keep them coming. We're going to have an opportunity for Q&A at the end. But next, I'd love to also just hear from you, Ismail, as well. You mentioned as well just the ways that Loiter is really defining as you go. And so I would love to hear how your model has evolved in response to different moments, maybe how decision making looks different in your context, and some of the lessons that you've learned.
No, for sure. And yeah, good luck on that grocery for sure. Like totally get it. We have a couple grocery stores in Boston, and when I came back to East Cleveland, everybody was like, "Yo, put a grocery store." I'm like, no, we're not ready. Like, so get it. And even though that's part of one of our larger goals, like the work to actually be able to establish a community-owned grocery with ethos-based sourcing and all the things that we want is very difficult. So definitely like feel that, get it. For us, it's like, I mean, we're kind of like constantly working at like how are we shifting away from the conditions that we're currently living in. Like we own our homes here, there are business owners here. Um, at the same time, we collectively understand that we aren't getting access to the same opportunity as development is happening across, like in the city, as starting to begin. So we're saying let's cop what we can. Let's like literally secure the pieces that we can, like that kind of like buy back the block. But at the same time, how do we ensure that it doesn't just stay within like a single family? How do we shift away from this? How how do we integrate the desire for us to own a home, but also put it into shared interspecies like development, right? We're talking about food, planet, people, infrastructure. How are we doing all this at the same time? And businesses, how do we say like we can we source from people's backyard? Can people grow on land that is, is currently in our possession as a community and shifting how things are showing up on in the marketplace on the main street? to hopefully signal what ethos-based policies could look like when we have a conversation with legislators, council members, et cetera. So what we're trying to do is really come at it from this like, hey, if we're going to do development in this city, East Cleveland, for context, East Cleveland is not a neighborhood of Cleveland. It's an interim suburb of East Cleveland. It's 3.5 square miles of 92% Black folks living here. And it's 5 council members. It has a weak mayor system in the context of like you need 3 to pass something and you need 4 to veto. So if we actually organize around things that are working, we can put in place ethos-based policies and connect them to a charter or some sort of legislative process that can actually put in things and connect it to how we run this city. And because the majority of the residents that are here own the current property and the businesses, how can we shift it into the ethos that we're sharing that we need that serve the current needs of the community, like on housing that exists, right? The poverty rate, like the fact that our median income is like $15,000 in this city. So what are the things that we can do that aren't connected to traditional status quo thinking, doing for economic development work? So we're like, all right, look, we've got a business that is a fermented food company that's Black owned, that is doing some production. How can we then source it from some of these farms that we're collectively investing in, and then that product then goes to this production facility, and then that production facility is then one of the anchor tenants in this community-owned real estate property that we have. And so now you have a circular economy that's connected, and then we can show that the dollar stays within the community in a very real way and is protected because we've put our ethos into practice, and then we can pitch that to policymakers to say, let's protect it by actually saying when development happens in the future, let's have some sort of stipulation around how more ethos-based development could happen and put some demands on external people who aren't really dealing with the things that we're stewarding right now. And so that is how we're doing it. We're trying to like really signal our power in a very real way. But putting it in the context of love-based transactions that prioritize the ownership that we currently have. And it's difficult to talk fully, on a recorded platform because some of this stuff is literally like, we're just kicking it in the back, you know, back of the house, figuring stuff out because this is liberatory work at its core. And so when we start to design things and start to position things, threats do come. And so we are also trying to figure out how and when we share, what are the pieces that are actually going to be attached to the current economic model, and what are the things that we're going to shift away from so we can show up in multiple spaces. Because to be real, like even my people in my family aren't like, yeah, put my house in a trust. They're like, man, my house is worth 45,000 bucks, and I'm trying to hold on to this thing as much as I can because you know what, I'm not really down for that. We're saying, well, look, can you at least offer the space in your backyard or the adjacent lot to you so we can grow lemongrass and mint, and then you can sell that to the cafe that's opening up the street? The answer is usually yes. So presenting opportunities for a shared economy that doesn't necessarily put a threat on a family that has been investing in our community for 30 years is what the opportunity that we're providing to people. So it's a challenge because, and I'll just say one more piece. Another thing that we're doing is like the research that we're doing is based upon like literally what we're going through. Like if you're talking about a house that in some cases is $23,000, right? And this is like a 2,000 square foot home, right? But when you look at the actual physical materials, like the local bricks, right? The you can sell like 10 pallets of brick for $5,000. You can get seven cherry beams on Etsy for $7,000, right? So now all of a sudden, just for material costs in the secondary and tertiary market, the valuation of our actual homes is way more than what the current racialized system is giving us. So we're trying to collect those narratives of what true value, even on the secondary and tertiary market, does not meet the current racialized valuation. So then when we sit down with policymakers, we can say, no, 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 we don't go by Zillow and walkability score and safety measures because that's what you use to actually take our property away. So we need different metrics to actually signal how we actually know the true value that we have. And hopefully that resonates with our community to say, stand on business. We're not going anywhere. We know what we got. So it's the edification and the community building and the sort of like complete buy-in of the whole that we're trying to tap into as Loiter.
Yeah, thank you so much. There's so much there that I'm excited to get into. And I think especially this last piece around knowing that the true value of what you have is so much higher than what the racialized systems are saying, and this need to really reframe this. I feel like that's a really good place to bring you into this conversation, Kurt, too, particularly from your standpoint, thinking about the financing of this all. I know you said earlier you're not really just thinking about capital, just not just as a tool on the process, but really thinking about this from the power shifting lens. And so I'd love if you could just talk a little bit more about the funding models, how you come into this conversation around like understanding what the true value is.
Yeah, so there's a few components to this question. I guess there's kind of like a technical, structure, like what does capital look like? But then there's also a process. And I think starting with the process is really important because in the most successful cases of community owned real estate or success in that it was a smooth process as much as possible, it's never smooth or easy. There are lenders and investors who are like down with what is going on with this project, showing up differently, being in service to the project rather than taking ownership. Being willing to support community leaders and like understanding their processes and what technical terms are. A lot of folks leading this project are coming from community organizing backgrounds, housing, might not be a finance or a development background. So being willing to be in dialogue as a true partner is rare, but when it does happen, it's really critical because capital is an important tool, as I said, and this process can be really important for shaping long-term transformation of funders and investors. We've seen some really amazing examples of, say, CDFIs or other lenders who have done one deal, participated as a partner in one of these types of projects, and then gone on to kind of add that in as a lens to their ongoing work. Community Vision in California is a great example of a CDFI lender that really shows up as a partner. And CDFI is Community Development Financial Institution for anyone not familiar with the long acronym. The other side of this question, with respect to product structure, is also super important. Just to acknowledge that the typical kinds of lending projects used in development, so like pre-development capital, loans for acquisition, loan for construction, and then takeout and permanent financing, is often not working with the timeline and the cost structure of community ownership, especially early on in like pre-development and acquisition phases. A big risk for the community side is taking on a lot of debt early on if they're still figuring out exactly what their model is, which properties or assets they want to acquire. So if early stage funding is not patient, it could be long-term repayment period or a grace period where repayments don't have to start until acquisition or until revenue is coming in. If you don't have anything like that, it can be really destabilizing for the project and maybe even cause it to shut down before that acquisition is possible. even better than debt is equity or equity-like investments. And the kind of twist in a community ownership situation is that equity normally comes with voting rights, or some sort of say in how the process happens. If investors truly want to respect the community ownership and the power building and the governance angle to these projects, they can do or help the project offer non-voting equity shares. And it's definitely less common to see equity investments in these projects. More often, you see that kind of role of money that doesn't have to be repaid on a certain timeline being taken up by grants, whether that's from philanthropy or from different sources of government financing. But to the extent that investors are participating, really respecting that decision-making process, and long-term ownership by the community is so important. So we can talk about structuring all day long, but I think ultimately it kind of comes down to the elephant in the room of cost of capital. And that investors are really too cautious when it comes to risk assessment, especially when coming across things they haven't seen before, projects that are being developed by first-time developers, so folks who don't kind of come from the same circles, they're not buddies and going to Wharton or wherever. That is where a lot of racial bias comes in, and that really factors into actually the numbers and how they assess risk and the rate of return and other terms of the capital that they offer. So when we think about cost of capital, there's really kind of a gap in this catalytic investment. So investment that is flexible in some kind of way, whether it's repayment timeline, interest rate, could be forms of guarantees that help make it easier for another investor to come in. That kind of capital is really what would help transform this movement if there was more availability of that. There is some PRI, program related investment, opportunities with foundations filling that role. There are some high net worth individuals, family offices, but really there's only so many low hanging fruits of the types of institutions who are currently offering that. So we, Transform Finance, are really focused on trying to unlock more of that kind of money. And then the last thing, I saw a question in the chat or the Q&A on CDFIs. I just want to say that's a great question. CDFIs are often not showing up in this space as you might think. In fact, some projects are leaving CDFIs for commercial banks because it's actually pretty similar terms, but you don't have to do impact reporting on top of all of that. There's that time requirement. So like Community Vision, there are some standout partners, but the industry is kind of traditional and hard to move, and I think that should be a narrative focus for the field.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kurt. I think that's a really helpful layout of so many of the pieces that are really needed to provide more supportive financing in these cases. And I'd love to just hang here for a second, particularly around this point around cost of capital and the way that investors are too cautious about risk assessment. I want to also just bring up the point that you raised earlier, Ismail, too, about what true value means and like what it means to communicate this around funding and like the many other elements that are needed for a supportive ecosystem. So I'll actually just open the floor to see if any of you have any reactions or something that you want to share here.
Yeah, I can jump in for a sec. I mean, I got kind of tickled, Kurt, when you were like, because again, I think our whole position is like there's no like currently in East Cleveland, so for further context, and it's hard to really get fully aware. So there's no bank in the city of East Cleveland. So therefore, if you think about the future development that's going to come with the East Cleveland, that it's going to be backed by an external function already. So our job right now is to show that we've de-risked the initial investment. So what we're leaning into is strong narrative, like we're dope, you know we're dope, and if you don't give us some money, you're racist. Like that's our position. Like we have property, we have businesses, we're super successful, we're a collective of folks that are habitually excluded, and if you don't throw money in, then we have more advocacy work to do, unfortunately. So, but that's like, so we're leading with the the purpose of saying this is how these are the transactions that are currently moving within our currently set up economy with the resources and assets that we're in control over. So we already have a functioning economy. And so a further investment would actually scale this up. So because of divestment, we've had to create our own economy based upon our controlled assets, talent, and equity. And then we're reaching out to those aligned folks to move in capital to support the expansion of this. So then we can then position ourselves when the RFP comes out to say, yo, you want impact metrics? It's already here, right? Literally, we are sourcing about and now our impact is going all the way to New York State because our priority is alignment. And yes, East Cleveland is the center of chasing. Now we can say East Cleveland is chasing alignment along the value chain to say we're looking for Black farmers. They don't exist in the context of the space that we're working in. So we're bringing in things from Ithaca. We just had 15 pallets of product dropped into East Cleveland to process and to be put onto the menu at the soon to open space this spring. So now you're talking about our ability because of our network that goes outside of East Cleveland. To your point, Adriana, yes, like we can bring external pieces to this because we're all connected to this extractive slave economy, but to devalue it and to invest in it in a different way, we have to have an alternative. We have to off ramp into something else. So what we're trying to show, like when you come to Maroon Square, everything in this space is, there's zero single-use plastic. Our entrepreneurs that used to look at their margins, we used to use styrofoam. Like, nah, it's all compostable. We're reusing the glass jars. No more plastic is allowed in this square footage that we're in possession of now. All the metrics of transformation and we're shifting over and the sort of the identity of what an environmentalist looks like is now a Black person, which of course is not what it's supposed to look like. The gentry usually are like, what culture are we bringing in? Let's show safety around the farmers market. Let's show the studies around when you do these things, it's now safe to invest. And we're saying we've been investing because we've prioritized our communities and we actually don't accept the narrative that it's not safe to be here. So invest now in the things that are currently here. Don't create something that you need to bring in. So it is and so we're trying to de-risk it right from the jump. Like it's already in motion. We have the assets, and thanks to some folks like Common Future and EFOD and other folks who are putting again this capital in. It's zero interest. It's non-extractive. We have three buildings that have zero debt on them right now. And so why would we go back to a PRI that now is requiring, 1 or 2 or 3% when the current capital stack we have doesn't look that way. And now that positions us in a powerful position to say buildings check, businesses check, cash flow check, debt not there, equity shared, employee ownership in the future, need investment in TA to get there. So now we can literally show the off ramp from the extractive economy to where we want to go. So we're reversing it from a position because we don't have the infrastructure. That's what happens when you have a wasteland of extractive capitalism. East Cleveland is a demonstration of that. It's its own city. And then potentially, this is like the rose glass is let's put this in the policy, let's protect it. And this is where we build the relationships with the policymakers, the council folks, the mayor, and say, hey, look, come on, this is about East Cleveland, let's protect it. So that's our lever once we continue to invest in this strategy. So that's kind of what we're looking at.
Victoria, if you're waiting for me, I'm sitting here like, which tangent or soapbox should I get on right now? Because I have several streams that I could go down. Like I'm still holding some of Kurt's comments, and now I've got Ishmael's comments, and I'm just like, well, pick your poison. Which one? I mean, I'll pick up and try to move quickly because I know we're trying to get to a couple more questions and get to Q&A. I just want to emphasize Kurt lifting up like the inception story around community ownership, right? Community ownership is hard because you're working inside of a system that's not built for you to collectively own. Hard blanket statement, right? Like that's not what is desired within our capitalistic, so-called democratic structure that we exist in here. Now, let's pretend that you decide that you're going to go against the grain and do all the roadblock work and jump over all the hurdles. The reality is there is an inception where you do need some form of integrated blended capital in order to make it work because you are going to have to do the technical assistance and the legal work and the financing structure and do the capacity building and build out a team, and you have to develop your governance and you have to do some of those early stage acquisitions. And as we learned when we were launching the trust 6 years ago, there's some folks who, to Ishmael's point, are not going to come in until that proof of concept is there, right? Until that first pilot or two project is done. They're going to say, you know what, this from a traditional capital standpoint, this feels risky. And I think what we've done at the trust is say, well, like risk to whom, right? Because the real risk lies in the neighborhood that doesn't get reinvested into and that continues to be allowed to have systemic harms and policy changes and disinvestment that continue to impact the trajectory of generations to come. And we know that those who control the land control the future. That's just a hard fact. And so the thing that I think I'm holding as I'm trying to put together all these beautiful nuggets that are coming out of this conversation is that doing this work is hard, it's messy, it's complicated, but it can be so beautiful, right? Like the outcomes of what is possible, the futures that we're designing for, the possibilities that we're imagining, and then leading those into fruition. That's the work, right? Like that's where we need the investment, that's where we need the support. And I think to Kurt's point around like, is it equity investment? Is it CDFI? Is it government? Is it philanthropy? Is it gifts? So many different options. Each project is going to determine for themselves what they want to have inside of their project. But ultimately, I think the most important part for any of those levers is to acknowledge that you don't have to have power over the structure in order to invest in it. And I think that gets lost sometimes. And I just want to lift up, right? Like we also have an investment from Common Future. And I just want to double click on the relationship and the collaboration that exists with folks across the country, like Katali and Spring Point and Cordata. Some of these folks who are just so deeply value aligned and really understand the breadth and scope of this work, they show up as partners. They show up as colleagues, as collaborators. There's no power dynamic that exists. There's no, oh, let me get this report from you, this due, right? Like some of the traditional philanthropic capital herding methodology just goes out the door. And we start from what does the right relationship look like? And how does that help you to achieve what you need to do? Right now, KCT is in the middle of a large raise. I am literally in texting mode with everybody in our ecosystem, right? Just, hey, can you do this? Can you do that? Can I leverage this? Can you help me get in this room? Can you help me connect with this person? And people are more than willing because they see the potential of what is possible when we all collectivize around this work rather than continuing to play power battles and power dynamics and traditional capital markets, because that's not what's going to allow this work to succeed and to replicate and to multiply.
Thank you so much. That was helpful because there are so many nuggets that I'm excited for us to go into. We have about 10 minutes left. So with my next question, I'm going to weave in a question that also came from the chat. So I'd love to just talk a little bit more about the policy angle of this. I know especially you started to allude to this, Ismail, too. I would love to hear what are some of the policy movements that are going on right now that reflect what's needed, what isn't there, what's coming up for you? I can turn back to you, Adriana.
Yeah, happy to. So at the Kensington Quarter Trust, I think I said this at the start of the call, but just want to relift up that we're doing the collectivization of ownership to build neighborhood wealth and to change policy and systems. Real estate is a tool in that work, in imagining a different possibility and a different outcome for neighborhoods like Kensington. And we are never doing this work alone. Not the work of building the trust, not the work of doing policy, not the work of thinking about the ecosystem of collective ownership. And as we are moving in coalition, both locally in the city of Philadelphia and at the state level in Pennsylvania, and then nationally with folks like New Economy Coalition and Right to the City and some of those other folks, there's a lot of really positive policy that's coming out that has real potential to be replicated One that passed recently in New York was COPA, so the Community Opportunity to Purchase Act. We are really hoping to figure out how to get that replicated across the country. We were not a part of supporting that in any way, shape, or form because we're not based in New York. But it is something that allows communities to have the first right of refusal when large apartment buildings are coming up for sale, when city dispositions are happening, when land is being disposed of by the city of New York. Those types of opportunities, those direct pathways to access to giving neighborhoods control are exactly what we need. You then couple that with things like what's happening in Seattle with the social housing tax, what's happening in Philadelphia with increased budget for the home budget, which is what allows for preservation and creation of affordable housing. All of these different levers that exist, and people are really thinking creatively, right? I think people are thinking really creatively about what is possible. I think from a policy standpoint, right, like as a person who has a public policy background, I'm always thinking about like where's the multiplier. The thing that I think is kind of the difficulty or the challenge that exists is we as people in this movement start to see it as a Seattle thing, a New York thing. Oh, that happened there. That can only work there. And that is that type of lens or perspective is what continues to limit us and bind us in these movements and as people who are organizing in our communities. You know, at the Kensington Quarter Trust, we organize across 4 policy campaign priorities, one of which is land justice and sovereignty, and a second of which is affordability. And they go hand in hand, right? Like you control the land, you control the mix of affordability, you control the outcomes of how that land is ultimately utilized, right? And they get to determine how it's ultimately utilized. I think we as an organization are thinking very intentionally about how do we leverage some of the wins that are happening across the country and bring those home rather than trying to be the innovators of something. I'm not trying to innovate squat else other than the neighborhood trust model that we thought was a great idea to build 6 years ago. Tell me how to do the social housing tax. Tell me how to pass COPA, right? Like, I don't need to come out of the box with some brand new shiny thing. If it's working for you and it's something that's allowing collective ownership to continue to advance and grow and multiply, then I want to just replicate. I want to be part of the team on the ground that helps to mobilize and organize around something that we know has the ability to be impactful and then move it to scale, right? Like, not just Philly, whole states, right? Like, why are we looking at city level policy? Whole states. So yeah, so I'll stop there, but I think the policy piece is so critical to the finance element, to the land ownership element, to just the collectivization of things, right? Even like employee ownership or sharing of intellectual property, sharing of digital mesh networks, community solar, right? Like all of these things are highly regulated and have policies behind all of them. And I think it's a misstep and a missed opportunity if we don't start to take some of those wins from across the country and help to replicate them in our own communities.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll try and be quick. Uh, so on the policy side, power is connected to policy, to your point. If we can get in early enough and say we hold the power, we hold the land, we hold the businesses, we actually are holding the tax benefit to that currently is happening in this small city. Um, we can now set things up. Currently, it's illegal to compost in East Cleveland. You're not allowed to have chickens. You're not allowed to have bees. All the things that we're talking about, multi-species development, you can't do currently based upon the current charter because it has not been updated since 1970 or whatever. So because we know these things are going to naturally change when whiteness comes in, which is what always happens, how about we start to change it now based upon the people who currently have the power and the competencies and the resources to do so? That changes who led to the change of the community. It just be, and I think that is really the focus of our work right now. Is like showing how our power can show up when we can show up into meetings to say, hey, look, this is what we're advocating for, and yeah, we're doing it anyway because other stuff is illegal to do in the city too, and it happens. And we challenge you to stop doing what we're doing. I'm saying this is where it becomes some of the stuff that we do is based upon our just our the things that we hold and the leverage that we know we have. And whether or not the elected officials listen to us is not within our hands. And the other piece is in larger cities. I mean, we do think being in a small inner ring suburb is actually advantageous to model it out because of what happens in these bigger cities. Like it's just like the power that we do not have, like it makes it very difficult for pushback. And so what we're trying to say is we actually are enjoying the size of this city, like small government in this ridiculously now red, no longer purple, state of Ohio, that we have to be able to signal that we're not going anywhere and power does exist. So resources from a transactional way need to come to this municipality. And if they don't, then we can put power at the county level to say, county, you need to show up differently for your constituents. So it's really trying to move in that space with community power, but also having the transactions in hand and the receipts to say, this is what's currently happening. And then one other piece that we do to leverage that is we currently are engaging with rural communities. We're in Cuyahoga County, but 100,000 pounds of produce was purchased from Amish communities who themselves are connected to a dying economy in their respective spaces. So even though we're a Black-led, you know, organization, we are interfacing with folks who benefit from transactions beyond our current geography in different counties. And that's the type of power and leverage you have when you are part of market making that just doesn't affect you and your people.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And Kurt, I'd also just love to turn to you. Maybe if we can just speak very briefly about what this might look like beyond legislation, some of the funding pieces, particularly at city, state, national levels.
Yeah, I mean, Adriana mentioned a bunch of different ways that governments can put money into these projects. We are doing a review and actually have like a survey out right now looking at capital stack construction sources of capital, so we can try to see patterns in like how did we unlock some of these in different cases. And most of the public money is coming from state and local rather than federal. And I think there's a ton of unexplored options. Like, what would it look like to have state financing agencies? What would it look like to have municipal bonds dedicated for community ownership? The public banking conversation that could be transformative to have a friendly entity that revolves and puts money out and is funded permanently and can make investments every year. And I really don't think that we get to like long-term sustainability of this movement without that public incentive or that public money. I like to remind myself all the time that affordable housing development would not happen if there was not public support. It's not profitable for investors in this market. So the public piece is really, really fundamental. And I think, sharing experience around, how different policy wins were made, like the land bank in Los Angeles, COPA and TOPA in different cities. Some cities have acquisition funds. Those are, really important to look at right now.
Yeah. Thank you so, so much. This was such a rich conversation. I wish we could continue this all day, but I want to thank you all so much for your time. Thank you to the panelists. I know that we got to a number of the Q&A questions just naturally throughout the conversation, but we've also just included the information for the panelists here. And so please reach out to just follow their work. And we'll also make sure that we address any remaining questions in our write-up on Common Futures website after this. So thank you so much for joining today and just being part of this really important conversation. Thank you, everyone.